In this session, we will explain the two-stage DCF model and the concept of terminal value. The value of a business using the intrinsic value approach, which is the DCF approach, is its future cash flows discounted at a required rate of return demanded by investors, which is the WACC, and the present value of these future cash flows at the WACC will give you the business value. But how far into the future do we forecast cash flows? Well, businesses are assumed to be going concerns, meaning that they will operate into perpetuity, into the foreseeable future. So how does the DCF model incorporate future cash flows which go into perpetuity? The DCF model does this in two stages. The value of a firm using the DCF approach consists of stage 1, which is the projection period, typically about 3 to 5 years, and stage 2, which is the terminal value. Let's discuss stage 1 first. The projection period refers to the time period that your forecast covers. Valuation best practice recommends the projection period to extend until the business has matured and the growth of the business stabilized. For example, startup businesses have high growth expectations, and as such, we can have longer projection periods for a startup business as compared to a mature business. Just because of its growth profile, it's expected to grow for much more longer. That being said, since we cannot predict the future, most forecasts typically go up to, say, 3 years or 5 years. Now, some businesses may be able to forecast more accurately for even longer periods, say 10 years, because they have more predictable cash flows, which could be due to signed agreements or concessions. So ideally, you should set the projection period based on two things. One is, what stage is the business? And two, when will the business mature and stabilize? However, you don't want a projection period that's too long, say more than 5 years, unless you are confident on the expectations beyond this period. At the end of the day, forecasting is estimation. The further we predict into the future, the more prone to error our estimates become. If your projection period is only 5 years, how do you incorporate future cash flows into perpetuity into your DCF model? And that's where the terminal value comes in. The terminal value solves the problem of having to forecast a business into perpetuity. The terminal value assumes that after the projection period, the cash flows grow at a constant, stable rate forever. That is why we stress the importance of the business needing to have been matured and stabilized during stage 1. So when you calculate your terminal value, your business is now at a stable level, and you can then apply a terminal value which assumes that after the projection period, the cash flows will grow at a stable rate forever. Now, there are two methods to calculate terminal value. The one is the Gordon growth model and the other is the exit multiple method. Since we recommend the Gordon growth model, for the remainder of this session, we will focus on this method. Let's kick off the discussion on the Gordon growth formula with the terminal growth rate, which is a very important assumption. The terminal growth rate is the rate at which the company will grow forever. That is, its perpetual growth rate. The DCF valuation tends to be very sensitive to this assumption, and I will show why later. Valuation practitioners assume that most businesses, once they mature and stabilize, will eventually grow at the same rate as the overall economy. Hence, we typically make reference to the target country's long-term GDP growth rate or inflation rate when we derive the terminal growth rate. If the terminal growth rate selected is higher than the long-term GDP rate, then the assumption is that the business's growth will outpace the economy forever. And this is a bold assumption to make, so you better have a solid explanation as to why. In some cases, for example, high-tech companies, in that case, it is possible to have a terminal growth rate which is higher than the long-term GDP growth rate of the country. On the other hand, if the terminal growth rate is lower than the long-term GDP growth rate of the country in which the business operates in, then the assumption is that the business will shrink in relation to the overall economy. And this doesn't sound like a business anyone would want to invest in. You could find the long-term GDP growth rates and inflation rates of a list of countries at the International Monetary Fund's website, or you could make reference to the United Nations Department of Economic and Social Affairs website. Next, let's discuss the terminal year free cash flow to the firm. We can use the final year in our projection period as the terminal year. So if we had a 5-year projection period, year 5 would be the terminal year. What is the terminal year and why is it so important? Because the terminal year will assume to go on forever when we calculate terminal value, the assumptions used in the terminal year need to be normalized and stabilized. And these assumptions are things like margins, working capital days, capex, and depreciation. Let me discuss each one in detail. So first we start with margins. When we talk about normalized margins, we can look at the gross margin, the EBIT margin, and we can also include the effective tax rate here. We typically make reference to the target company's historical margins to derive a margin which is normalized. But you can also benchmark to the margins of comparable companies, which serves as a really good reasonableness check. So for example, say historically a company has only been able to achieve EBIT margins of between 8% and 12%. And in the terminal year, you assume an EBIT margin of 20%. Does this 20% sound like a normalized, stabilized EBIT margin? Of course not, because if historically the company hasn't been able to achieve 20%, then why are you betting that it's going to normalize and stabilize at 20%? So another cross-check that you could do when you're analyzing the terminal year EBIT margin is to make reference to the EBIT margins of the comparable companies, the industry as a whole, and then do a sensible check or a reasonableness check to see if your terminal year EBIT margin is within the range of the industry or the comps. Then we talk about working capital days. And similar to normalized margins, make reference to the historical working capital days or perhaps the target working capital days of the company according to its policies, or you could benchmark to the working capital days of the comparable companies. Next is capital expenditures and depreciation and amortization in the terminal year. And a good indicator to analyze is the fixed asset turnover ratio, which indicates the level of fixed assets required to support sales. We discussed this in an earlier session on how to derive the financial projections, so I won't talk about this here, but I just want to make a point is that similar to how you have normalized margins, ensure that your terminal year capital expenditure results in a fixed asset turnover ratio, which makes sense when you compare it to historical years and when you compare it to your comparable companies. One thing to note is that depreciation and amortization expense in the terminal year should be lower or at least equal to terminal year capex. And this is because if your fixed assets depreciate faster than your capital expenditure, then in the long term, you will be left with no fixed asset base. And this doesn't make sense for a business which is a going concern. Most valuation specialists normalize this by equating depreciation and amortization to the terminal year capital expenditure. Now, I understand this is a mouthful, but I will go over the above steps in Excel when we build the DCF model together, and it will make much more sense when we do it in practice. Lastly, we move on to the discount rate. Since we are using free cash flows to the firm, the discount rate should be the WACC, the weighted average cost of capital. However, if we were using free cash flows to equity, then we would discount by the cost of equity. The discount rate is one of the most sensitive assumptions in the DCF. Even a 0.5% change in the discount rate can have massive impact to the overall valuation. And notice, we divide the cash flows by the discount rate less the terminal growth rate. So let's call this equation the capitalization rate or the cap rate. In general, if the cap rate decreases, the value goes up, and if the cap rate increases, the value goes down. So again, I want to reiterate the significance of the terminal growth rate. A higher terminal growth rate reduces the cap rate and drives the value up, and vice versa.